Walt Disney's Pete's Dragon. Most people do not understand dragons. They think dragons are all wicked creatures who like to scare people with their fiery breath. Poppycock. Take Elliott the dragon, for instance. He is so kindly and polite that he often becomes invisible just to keep from frightening anyone. Of course, he wasn't being invisible when he met Pete. But he knew right away that Pete wasn't like other people. Pete thought Elliott's green scales looked just right, and he liked it when Elliott breathed fire. A most sensible lad. Now, if Pete was sensible and kind, the terrible Gogin family he lived with were not. They made Pete work early in the morning until late at night. They shouted at him a lot, too. At last, Elliott did what any clever dragon would do. He arranged for Pete to run off with him. They ran and they ran until they came to a little seaside town of Passamaquoddy. Elliott became invisible since he didn't want to upset the townspeople. There, on the beach near town, they found a fine cave. It was just the proper size for a large dragon and a small boy, so they moved right in. Of course, it was a trifle damp. Elliott was about to warm it with a blast of his fiery breath when a young woman came hurrying along. She didn't see Elliott because he was invisible, but she did see Pete. "You look cold and hungry," she said to Pete. "My name is Nora. Come along with me to the lighthouse where I live." Pete went, since he certainly was cold and hungry. Elliott followed, as quiet as a dragon can. When he peeked through the window, he saw Lampy, Nora's father, tending the light that warmed the ships that kept them from running up on the reef. Elliott also saw Nora feeding Pete clam chowder. Then she tucked him into bed, just as a mother would do. The next day, Nora bought Pete some new clothes. He came and showed his new suit to Elliott, who thought he looked grand. His old clothes were so ragged that you could hardly call them clothes at all. The day after that, Nora took Pete to school. Elliott thought this was a perfectly good idea, since only dragons are born knowing everything they need to know. "Nora's a fine person," thought Elliott one day when he and Pete were on the beach. "She's exactly the sort of woman Pete should have for a mother. But why does she look so sad?" As he talked to Elliott, Pete mentioned that Nora was waiting for her sweetheart, a man named Paul who had sailed away many months ago. "His ship sank," said Pete. "Lampy says he's dead, but Nora's sure he's alive and he'll come back to her one day." "Ah," Elliott thought, "I wonder what I can do about that." Certain that Pete would behave himself, be kind to Nora, and help Lampy tend to the light in the lighthouse, Elliott disappeared. Pete didn't mind. He was used to it. What he didn't know was Elliott was gone, really gone, from the cave near the sea and the little town of Passamaquoddy. Elliott had to find Paul. Elliott did find Paul, and quite easily too, since dragons can do things that people wouldn't dream of. Paul was in a hospital far, far from Passamaquoddy. He had a nasty bump on his head when the ship went down, and he couldn't remember anything about Nora or Lampy or the lighthouse. Why, he couldn't even remember his own name. If a bump on the head did that to him, thought Elliott, no doubt another bump will set him right. He tipped over Paul's bed, and Paul came tumbling out. Just as Elliott had planned, Paul bumped his head exactly hard enough, but not too hard. "By golly," Paul cried, "now I remember. I'm Paul, and Nora is waiting for me. I must be very late." With that, he got dressed and rushed out of the hospital, looking for a ship that would carry him back to Nora. Elliott was proud of himself. Off he flew to Passamaquoddy to tell Pete that Paul would soon be home. But when he arrived, a surprise waited him. Pete wasn't at the lighthouse. He wasn't in the cave either. Where could he be? The dragon wondered. As Elliott raced along the beach, searching high and low, he seemed to hear Pete calling. Elliott followed his voice into town, and who should be there but the Gogans? They had put Pete in a sack and were hauling him away in a wagon. Well, Pete was Elliott's boy, and Elliott was Pete's own dragon. Was Elliott going to stand for that? No, indeed. Elliott stopped worrying about upsetting people. He became visible and charged at the Gogans, breathing fire and spreading clouds of smoke across the town. He roared like the gale that was blowing in from the sea. The townspeople tumbled over one another as they ran to get out of the way, and the Gogans went flying head over heels out of their wagon and one by one into a barrel of tar. When they pulled themselves out, they scooted out of town and never came back. No sooner had Elliott rescued Pete than another danger appeared. "The light," shouted the mayor of the town. "The light in the lighthouse is out." It was true, and Elliott knew that out on a dark and stormy ocean was the ship that was carrying Paul home to Nora. It would surely run into the rocks unless someone lit the lamp again. Elliott sped to the lighthouse and blew his fiery breath at the big lamp in the tower. The light flared brightly, and Paul's ship steered clear of the reefs and came safely into the harbor. There was hugging and kissing, and shouting and cheering, and the loudest cheers were for Elliott the dragon, the greatest dragon, visible or invisible, ever to come to Passamaquoddy. Elliott felt quite pleased with himself. Pete could be safe at the lighthouse with Nora and Paul, and whenever Elliott wanted to visit him, he could, because now the people of Passamaquoddy understood about dragons. The end. I hope you've enjoyed this story. Pete's Dragon. Grandma surely did. I remember hearing this story when I was a little girl. In other words, this book is really old. And I'm looking forward to seeing the new movie out this month. Anyway, I do hope you come back to hear more stories. Bye, Grandma.